Hey everyone, Tactics here with another Season 1 Mythic Plus guide for Dragonflight, this time taking a look at the revamped dungeon returning this season's SHADOWMOON Burial Grounds. In this video, I'll be covering things like important interrupts and stops to look out for, what the bosses do and how to handle those things, and even a simple, easy to execute thundering route that you can use that will be great for pugging early on in the season. One thing to note when talking about some of these older dungeons is that there are some pretty heavy changes to how these dungeons function compared to how they did back in the day. There's several new trash mobs in some of them, there's reworked abilities and complete and total boss fight changes, and I'll be looking at all of those adjustments here in this video. I already have a bunch of videos just like this one for a lot of the other Season 1 dungeons, with the rest shortly on the way, and once the season actually starts, I'll be putting out more advanced routing guides as well as high-key walkthroughs from a tank's perspective, so if any of that sounds like content you'd be interested in seeing, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss a single video. With that said, let's get this guide started, and right off the bat you'll be faced off with some of these SHADOWMOON Bone Menders. These guys have an interrupt in Shadow Bolt, which is a tank targeted shadow hit. They also have a heal in Shadow Mend. This is a 50% single target heal. You'll want to either interrupt this or stop it as well. They also have a pretty nasty random target magic dot in Shadow Word Frailty. This also reduces your max health by 50%, so very scary. You want to make sure you dispel this as there is no cast time on it, and know that actually priests who mind control this mob can also use this ability, so potentially some interesting tech there. These guys are often joined by reanimated ritual bones. These guys only have a tank hit in Void Slash. This tank hit does hit pretty hard though, so just be aware of that. It's pure shadow damage. Once you round the first corner, you'll see a void spawn padding around in this area, and these guys have a void pulse ability. This has been pretty heavily changed, not interruptible, completely unavoidable in that way, and it's just a direct damage hit. However, you can LOS it using the corners nearby, and that's likely what you'll want to do in higher keys. It also has a void eruptions, which just shoots a bunch of swirlies over the course of a channel that you just want dodge. SHADOWMOON Loyalists and Defiled Spirits are on either side here. For the Loyalists, they just have a self magic buff in Sinister Focus, so you can purge that. This gives them a bunch of haste and move speed. For the Defiled Spirits, they'll use Cry of Anguish, so they'll jump to a random player. They'll do a 6-yard AoE channel, and if you get hit by that, you are pacified for a few seconds. This is stoppable as well, so up to you there. You can either just walk out of it or stop the cast. Both will work. That brings you to the first boss of the dungeon, Sadana Bloodfury. Occasionally this boss will use Daggerfall, which spawns 3 swirlies above random players that slowly fall towards the ground, pulsing for AoE damage within 4 yards, so just some area denial here. Whispers of the Dark Star is also a cast throughout the fight, which is just some channeled party damage you need to heal through. One of the more notable mechanics is Dark Communion, which spawns an ad across the room from the boss that just runs towards her, and you'll heal her for 10% of her HP and give her a 20% damage buff for 20 seconds if it reaches her. On beta, these ads were completely CCable, so things like stuns, slows, and even more permanent CCs like Paralyze and Entangling Roots would work. This led to something which may not actually be intended, and just hard CCing those mobs and ignoring them while making the boss do that full channel, and therefore losing some of her ability cast over the course of the phase. This may be fixed at some point, but currently that's definitely the best strategy here to handle those ads and get some extra boss damage. The big dangerous ability of this fight is Dark Eclipse, which causes Sadana to jump to the center of the room and begin to slowly cause shadows to move across the platform, exploding for lethal damage after 6 seconds. During this time, several of the moon runes around the platform begin to glow, and if you stand within them, you'll gain an 80% damage reduction, allowing you to survive this hit. A couple notes on this. 1, you can share this rune with other players, so everyone could stack within a single rune if you wanted to. And 2, this rune does give you a buff, but this buff disappears if you leave the rune, so you want to be sure that you are physically inside of a rune whenever the actual eclipse cast finishes. Outside of this, for tanks, any successful melee attack from the boss will give her 3 stacks of Death Spike, which just causes her additional autos past that to deal some shadow damage, so just be aware of that. Moving through to the next area, there's only a few mobs here between you and the next boss. There's the SHADOWMOON Dominators. These guys have Domination, which is a mind control cast here. So definitely an extremely high priority. You can kick it, you can stop it, and it is also a curse to spell if for some reason it does go through, so be aware of that. Otherwise, these guys will just use Rending Void Lash, which is just an interruptible and stoppable channeled ability into a random target that just deals shadow damage. Throughout this area, you'll notice these small rectangles with a bit of a purple glow, and if you step on these, it'll spawn an exhumed spirit. These guys have the incorporeal buff on them. This is just a magic shield for 50% of their HP, so you can purge this to get rid of a bunch of their health right off the bat, and otherwise they'll just cast Death Blast. This is a random target shadow hit, interruptible and stoppable, and this is a very lethal hit here, so be careful of that. Patrolling in this area are SHADOWMOON Exhumers, and these guys will cast Exhume the Crypts. It is not stoppable because this is a lieutenant mob, and what it'll do is it'll disturb the Crypts, those things I just mentioned, the small squares with the purple glow, all of them within 45 yards, and spawn those exhumed spirits, so be aware of that. Otherwise, these guys just have Void Bolt, another random target shadow hit that you can interrupt, but of course, because this is a lieutenant mob, you cannot stop it. Once you've made your way through this area, you'll arrive at the second boss, Nhallish, who is pretty straightforward. Tanks, you'll want to be aware of that Void Blast hit. Is a big channeled set of shadow damage ticks to you over 3 seconds, and definitely the most dangerous tank hit in the entire dungeon, so make sure you have something up for any of these casts. After this tank hit, the boss will use Planner Shift, teleporting on top of a random player and starting to channel Void Vortex, which is an AoE that just constantly pulls players in, and it ticks for damage if you're inside of it, so you just want to make sure you're running away. Shortly after this channel finishes, the boss will use Soul Steal, splitting each party member into their own phase where they need to kill their own possessed soul and then interact with it to escape. This soul just runs around and channels Soul Shred, which deals some light ticking damage to the player, and once you kill it, you get a 40% damage and healing increase for 20 seconds, and you're able to return to the boss phase. Note that this ad takes 50% additional damage from Holy and Nature spells, so it may be worthwhile to use those if you usually wouldn't, just for some extra damage. The last ability the boss has is Void Devastation, which is a channeled ability that spawns large swirlies all over the room that leave behind puddles for a short period of time you just want to stay away from. Moving forward, you'll face a few different types of beasts. You've got the monstrous corpse spider. These guys will just spam cast Necrotic Burst. This is an interruptible and stoppable cast that puts a disease on all party members within 60 yards. That also has a 25% healing reduction, so very important that you prevent this from going off. There's also plagued bats in this area, and they have Plague Spit, which is another random target hit. This also applies a disease if it goes off, which is a 12-second dot that has a stacking 50% slow. So 2 stacks of this, and you do not move whatsoever. Also interruptible as well as stoppable, so be aware of that as well. Finally, there are a couple carrion worms that spawn along the bridge to the third boss. These guys have a tank hit in Fetid Spit. This is just a shadow damage tank hit, and they have a Body Slam, which is a frontal line attack targeted at the tank that will knock back anyone hit. This does not follow the tank, so the tank is free to sidestep, just so they avoid that as well. You note that these worms will disappear once they hit 20% health, and they'll come back a little bit later when we actually get to the boss. Once you get past these worms, you'll be able to get to Bonemaw's platform, and this guy is a stationary giant worm boss. He'll occasionally disappear and reappear though at another point on the platform, so there's still some movement involved. The boss itself does share some of those abilities from the worms that I just mentioned, including that frontal line attack Body Slam and the shadow tank hit in Fetid Spit, but one more important ability is Necrotic Pitch, which throws a puddle at a random ranged player that deals light ticking damage and slows you by 70% while you're inside it. Why this is important is because it saves you from his Inhale cast, which is a channel the boss uses to just try and suck all the players towards him, which if he's successful at doing, he'll snap them up and deal a bunch of damage to them and then throw them off the side of the platform. Luckily, you are able to actually swim back and jump back up onto the platform if you do survive that bite attack, but it takes a bit of time, so it's definitely a heavy damage loss regardless. You'll need to use these necrotic pitch puddles that I just mentioned in order to slow your movement and avoid getting sucked into the boss's mouth. Speed boost can also actually work here if you're fast enough. Just be careful to position yourself to the sides of the boss's mouth if you're doing so, otherwise there's a good chance you get eaten as well, regardless of your speed. After the first Inhale cast, the 2 worms from before that ran away will reappear at their 20% HP mark, adding even more lines that you need to avoid. On lower keys, it's likely you just kind of want to ignore these guys when they spawn in, just so you don't waste any additional damage on them because they are fairly spread out. Though in high keys, it's possible that you will actually need to kill these guys ASAP because of the extra damage they end up putting out. There's no new trash between this boss and the last boss, so we'll talk a bit about him, Ner'zhul. He has surprisingly few abilities here. Omen of Death is a small circle that spawns at random ranged players' location. This deals pulsing party damage based on how close you are to that circle, so you want to try and bait these away from the center of the room so you can deal with other mechanics without taking that big ticking damage. In terms of what those other mechanics are, Malevolence is a random target frontal cone that deals shadow damage and reduces players' damage by 50% if you're hit, so you want to try and dodge this. And occasionally, Ner'zhul will summon a Ritual of Bones line that march across the platform, leaving behind void tendrils as they walk, which puts a pretty nasty dot on players that touch them. To prevent this, you'll need to kill at least one of these adds to create a path for the party to run through, but this can be a bit spooky depending on both Omen of Death bait locations and where the Malevolence cone shoots towards, so a lot of dodging and positioning on this boss fight. A big thing here is when trying to kill the bone ad, try and leave a bit of a gap between Ner'zhul and the ad itself, and just have the rest of your party stay in between the ad you're killing and the boss, so that all the cones are aimed through that line of ads and are much easier to dodge and don't prevent you from hitting the ad itself. That's it for the dungeon abilities, so let's move on to my simple pug-friendly route shown here in MDT, which I'll link down in the description below if you want to import this link for yourself. So pretty simple off the bat here. It's just a 3-pack off the top. A little unfortunate because of the mass distance between this and everything else, but you probably want to avoid as many of these void spawns as possible at the beginning of this dungeon, so we're just going to do that. This guy does pat back and forth here, and so you can just kind of sneak off to the left or right here as this guy is patting. One thing to note is these 4 ads are kind of channeling a spell, teleporting another void spawn between these 2 packs. Once you've actually engaged the pack, that teleport won't happen. So just when you're coming here, it's usually this left one, but just look at where the void spawn is in these 2 packs and go to that one that doesn't have it, because we want to avoid that void spawn like I just mentioned. So it could be left or right here, but it's likely left. And then you just kind of go straight here. These spiders are up top, these spiders are down in the bottom, but they don't do much damage and they have very low health. Just kill them quickly. Go down, you got 1 trash pack before going into the boss itself. And then you're moving across here. This pool has quite a few different kicks here. Right, you got the enslavers here that do have that mind control cast as well as that random target channel. So try and put kicks towards the mind control and stops and stuff towards the channel itself. Then you have the exhumers here that will pop up those additional spirit ads that have the absorb shield and the big random target hit. Those guys aren't actually giving count right now. So you just kind of have to kill them, and you want to kind of avoid all the other squares in here because they're all over the place. But basically how it's going to work in this area is this guy will spawn 2, this guy will spawn 2, and that'll be it. So there is a ring of them around the boss area, which you'll want to be careful not to step on during that boss fight. And it's the boss itself, and you can go through towards the next area here, just a few trash mobs. Watch, this guy does pat like along this area, so be careful, don't walk through the pack too far here. Watch his pat run down, and then you've got all the dudes here, which you're going to be killing pretty much everything here. Note that there is a skip for these worms, and that could alter your route a bit, but it does require some form of water walking, so something like shamans or DKs in your group in order to accomplish it, because you basically run around here, this outside edge, and you can avoid all these worms and plague bats and jump up onto the boss platform here, and that lets you fight the boss without having to engage any of these trash mobs here. That does of course mean that you will have to commit to ignoring these carrion worms on the boss fight, because they'll come in at 100% HP instead of 20% HP, but that is something that you're likely going to see maybe a bunch of high-end groups doing in high keys, because these mobs are not very efficient. They're very, very high health. You can't really pull much with them. They're just kind of annoying in terms of where they're positioned, so really not great for high keys. But the timer on this dungeon is extremely free, I promise you, so definitely something you probably just want to take a little slow here and just kill these guys, just because executing on that skip as well is probably going to be a little rough in pugs. I wouldn't trust it, so definitely just kill those guys here. Then you've got the boss platform here, followed by a 4-pack that's pretty easy, followed by probably the hardest pull in the dungeon. There's 2 of these void spawns. They're unavoidable because the door will not open until you've killed them, and so what you're likely going to see is pull these guys back to like this corner here, and that way all of your DPS and healer can LOS whenever they need to, when that big void pulse goes out here. Especially true if they end up syncing up. Sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. It varied here, so just be aware of that, and then cleave these guys down. Otherwise, you probably can heal through the void pulse hits here, especially after the nerf and the fact that there's no dodge, it's just an initial hit now. But you'll want to definitely commit things like defensives and healing CDs to that, because you won't really need it for Ner'zhul himself, who is immediately after that, so not really much trash between the bosses here. And overall, a very, very short dungeon. But that is it, guys. My full Mythic Plus guide to SHADOWMOON Burial Grounds for the first season of Dragonflight. If you enjoyed it, if you learned something, make sure you guys subscribe to the channel for more content just like it. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I have guides just like this one for all of the Season 1 dungeons, and I'll be putting out things like advanced routing guides as well as high key walkthroughs from a tank's perspective. So a lot of great things coming soon that you don't want to miss. If you have any questions about this dungeon or tanking or anything in general, feel free to drop those down below or come stop by my Twitch channel at Tactics and ask me there, and I'll do my best to answer. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.